Gangsters bullied a disabled widow in a wheelchair until 6 rangers walked in. Welcome to Dusk Tales. Let's uncover what really happened. If you can't stand bullies who prey on the weak, if you believe that true strength lies in defending those who cannot defend themselves, then you are exactly where you need to be. Because this isn't just a story about a vulnerable widow in a wheelchair. It's a story about the unbreakable bonds of brotherhood and the terrifying, righteous justice that follows when a sacred promise is broken. It began on a quiet, sun-drenched street, the kind of street that appears forgotten by the relentless march of time. Here in a small bungalow, with a meticulously kept rose garden, lived Eleanor Vance. Eleanor was a woman carved from a gentler era, her world now confined to the 4 walls of the home she had shared with her husband, Sergeant Major Michael Vance, and the smooth, worn wheels of her chair. A degenerative nerve condition had stolen her mobility years ago, but it had not touched the fierce spirit that resided within her. Her home was not just a structure of wood and plaster, it was a living museum, a sanctuary dedicated to the memory of a man who was a giant in both stature and heart. Every wall held a piece of him. Framed photographs captured a timeline of a hero's life, a young, grinning soldier in basic training, a steely-eyed ranger in the dense jungles of some forgotten conflict, a proud husband holding his wife on their wedding day, and finally, a decorated sergeant major, his chest a constellation of medals for valor, his eyes holding the weight of 100 battles, his dress uniform, preserved under glass, hung in the hallway, a silent, stoic guardian. Eleanor's days followed a gentle, predictable rhythm. Mornings were for tending to her potted plants on the accessible patio, her fingers, though gnarled with arthritis, still possessing a gardener's magic. Afternoons were for reading, surrounded by the scent of old paper and lemon polish. Evenings were for quiet reflection, watching the sun set through the window her husband had installed just for her, framing the world outside like a living painting. But the world outside was changing. The quiet street was slowly succumbing to a creeping decay. A shadow had fallen over the neighborhood, a shadow that wore leather jackets and rode engines that growled with menace. They called themselves the Vipers, a local gang that had grown from a pack of teenage troublemakers into a syndicate of petty tyrants. Their leader was a man known only as Razor, a creature of pure, undiluted malice. He was a man whose ambition was as ugly as the jagged scar that gave him his name, a white line that ran from his temple to the corner of his sneering mouth. Razor saw the neighborhood not as a community of homes, but as a chessboard of assets. And Eleanor Vance's house, with its corner lot and clear sightlines, was a valuable square he intended to control. The first sign of trouble was subtle, an ugly splash of crimson paint on her pristine white picket fence. It was their symbol, a coiled snake with fangs bared, a mark of territorial claim. Eleanor's heart had fluttered with a cold, unfamiliar dread. She scrubbed at the paint for hours, her arms aching, the chemical smell of the turpentine, a harsh invader in her fragrant garden. She told herself it was just kids, a random act of vandalism. But in the deepest part of her soul, the part that had learned to recognize threats from the tension in her husband's shoulders when he came home, she knew it was a prelude. It was the first whisper of a storm, a warning that the sanctuary she had so carefully preserved was about to become a battlefield. Her husband had fought for his country, for freedom, for the safety of strangers. Now Eleanor felt a chilling premonition that she would have to fight for the last piece of him she had left on this earth. The Vipers were circling, their presence a palpable stain on the air, and she was alone, a fragile bird in a cage they intended to shatter. The quiet whisper of the storm became a deafening roar. Less than a week later, it was a Tuesday, the air thick and heavy with the promise of a summer thunderstorm. Eleanor was trimming the dead leaves from her prize-winning rose bush, the one Michael had planted for their 10th anniversary, when the sound began. It was a low rumble at first, a vibration she felt in the rubber of her wheels before she heard it with her ear. The rumble grew, multiplying, a chorus of angry mechanical hornets converging on her small patch of peace. She looked up, her hands freezing mid-snip. 6 motorcycles, chrome gleaming like polished bone in the oppressive sunlight, blocked her driveway. The Vipers had arrived. They dismounted with a practiced, arrogant slowness, kicking down their stands in a series of clanking thuds that echoed like gunshots in the sudden silence. Razor was at their head, his scarred face a mask of predatory amusement. He sauntered toward her, his heavy boots crunching on the gravel path she and Michael had laid together stone by stone. The other 5 fanned out, creating a semicircle, a human wall of leather and denim and menace that cut her off from the rest of the world. They were a pack of hyenas, and she was the wounded gazelle they had cornered. "Nice place you got here, old lady." Razor's voice was a gravelly rasp, a sound like grinding glass. He didn't look at her, he looked at the house, his eyes filled with a covetous gleam. He ran a gloved hand along the smooth wood of the porch railing. Good bones, prime location. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of terror. She gripped the handles of her pruning shears, the metal cold and inadequate against her clammy skin. "What do you want?" Her voice was barely a whisper, swallowed by the sheer intimidating mass of them. Razor finally turned his gaze to her, and it was like being pinned by a physical force. His eyes were small and dark, chips of obsidian devoid of any light or warmth. "What do I want?" He chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "That's simple. I want your house." He gestured expansively with his hand. "Me and the boys, we need a new clubhouse. This one's perfect. Quiet street, corner lot, easy in, easy out." One of his cronies, a hulking brute with a shaved head and a tattoo of a spiderweb on his neck, laughed crudely. Eleanor's mind reeled. This couldn't be happening. This was her home, her sanctuary. It wasn't a clubhouse. It was the repository of her entire life, her love, her grief. "You can't have my house," she said, a flicker of her husband's defiant fire igniting within her. "This house is not for sale." Razor's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of cold fury. "I think you misunderstood me. I'm not asking to buy it. I'm telling you you're going to give it to a donation, to the community." He took another step closer, invading her personal space, his shadow falling over her. The smell of stale cigarette smoke and unwashed leather filled her nostrils, choking her. "You're an old woman, alone, in a wheelchair. Who's gonna stop us?" He leaned down, his face inches from hers. "Nobody." To punctuate his point, he reached out, and with a casual, brutal flick of his wrist, snapped the head off the prize-winning rose. The perfect crimson bloom fell to the ground, its petals crushed under the heel of his boot. An audible gasp escaped Eleanor's lips. It was as if he had struck her directly. That rose was more than a flower. It was a symbol, a living memory. In that moment, her fear was eclipsed by a wave of pure, righteous anger. "Get out," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "Get off my property, now." Razor just laughed again, a full-throated, mocking sound this time. "She's got fight in her," he said to his men, who joined in the laughter. "We'll be back, Eleanor. You've got 1 week to pack up your little trinkets and get out. After that we move in, with or without you." He turned and walked away, the others following him, their laughter echoing in the heavy air. They mounted their bikes, and with a final defiant roar of their engines that rattled the windows of her house, they were gone. Eleanor was left in the ringing silence, staring at the crushed rose on the gravel. Tears of fear, anger, and utter helplessness streamed down her face. The world she had known, the peace she had cherished, had been irrevocably violated. The week he had given her felt like a death sentence. The illusion of a civil society, with its rules and protections, shattered for Eleanor the very next morning. Clinging to a desperate sliver of hope, she did what any law-abiding citizen would do. She called the police. Her hands trembled as she dialed the number, her voice shaky as she explained the situation to the bored-sounding dispatcher on the other end of the line. She detailed the threats, the demand for her home, the chilling finality in Razor's voice. She was promised an officer would be by to take a report. 2 hours later, a cruiser ambled down her street, its slow pace suggesting a distinct lack of urgency. 2 officers, one young and wide-eyed, the other older, with a weary, cynical slump to his shoulders, got out of the car. They listened to her story with an air of detached patience, their eyes scanning her small, tidy home, lingering on the glass case containing her husband's uniform. Eleanor repeated everything, her voice pleading for them to understand the gravity of the threat. She pointed to the crushed rose, the tire tracks on her lawn, the lingering sense of violation that hung in the air like a foul odor. The older officer, whose name tag read Miller, sighed and clicked his pen. "Ma'am," he began, his tone patronizingly gentle, "we understand you're upset, but what you have here is a verbal dispute. There's no physical assault, no break-in." "He threatened me," Eleanor insisted, her voice rising. "He said he was taking my house in 1 week. He destroyed my property." Officer Miller scribbled a note on his pad. "We'll file a report for the vandalism of the flower. As for the rest, it's a he said, she said situation. Razor and his boys, they're smart. They know the line, they walk right up to it, but they don't cross it." His words were a bucket of ice water on the embers of her hope. "So you're not going to do anything?" she asked, disbelief coloring her tone. "We'll increase patrols in the area," the younger officer offered, a sliver of genuine sympathy in his eyes. But Miller cut him off with a look. "We'll keep an eye out," he said, the non-committal phrase a clear dismissal. "But honestly, ma'am, our hands are tied until they actually do something. You should consider maybe staying with family for a while, until this blows over." The suggestion was so outrageous, so insulting, that it left her speechless. Leave her home, abandon everything Michael had built for them. It was a surrender she was not willing to make. The officers left, taking with them a carbon copy of a useless report, and all of Eleanor's remaining faith in the system designed to protect her. Her isolation deepened over the next few days. The Vipers began a campaign of low-level psychological warfare. They would ride by her house at all hours of the night, their engines roaring, their headlights flashing through her windows. They would park across the street, just watching, their presence a constant, looming threat. But the most painful blow came from her community. Her neighbors, people she had shared coffee with over the back fence for 20 years, now seemed to find the pavement in front of their own shoes endlessly fascinating. Whenever she was outside, Miss Abel from next door, who used to bring her homemade jam, now scurried inside if she saw Eleanor on her porch. Mr. Henderson, across the street, who had always offered to help with her bins, now pulled his curtains shut. Fear was a contagion, and the Vipers had infected the entire street. No one wanted to be seen as her ally. No one wanted to become their next target. She was an island, completely and utterly alone, surrounded by a sea of fear and indifference. One afternoon, desperate for a human connection, she wheeled herself over to the Gables house. She could see them inside, their silhouettes, moving behind the sheer curtains. She rang the doorbell, once, twice. There was no answer. She could hear the television playing inside, a muffled game show. They were home. They were just choosing to ignore her. A profound, bone-deep sorrow washed over Eleanor, colder and more painful than the fear. This was what the Vipers had done. They hadn't just threatened her home. They had stolen her community, her sense of belonging. They had made her a pariah on her own street. As she wheeled herself back to her empty house, the silence of the neighborhood was more menacing than the roar of any motorcycle. It was the silence of abandonment. The world had turned its back on her. The police wouldn't help. Her neighbors were too scared to help. She looked at the photograph of Michael on the mantelpiece. His strong, smiling face, a painful reminder of the protection she had lost. "Oh, Michael," she whispered to the empty room. "What am I going to do?" The house, her sanctuary, now felt like a prison, and the walls seemed to be closing in. The 1-week deadline was ticking down like a bomb, and she had no one to turn to. Or so she thought. Hundreds of miles away in a quiet suburban town in Colorado, a man named Marcus Thorne, known to his friends as Dutch, was scrolling through his social media feed. Dutch was a man who seemed perfectly ordinary on the surface. He ran a small but successful contracting business, coached his son's Little League team, and was known for his calm demeanor and steady hand. But beneath the placid surface of his civilian life lay the bedrock of a different identity, forged in the crucible of conflict. Dutch had been a master sergeant in the 75th Ranger Regiment, serving alongside Sergeant Major Michael Vance for over a decade. They weren't just comrades, they were brothers, bound by an oath that transcended time and distance. Michael had been the rock, the unshakable center of their unit. Dutch had been the strategist, the one who saw the whole board. When Michael fell in his final tour, a piece of Dutch had fallen with him. He had stood at Michael's funeral, a silent sentinel in a sharp suit,
and made a quiet promise to his fallen friend. He would always look out for Eleanor. It was a promise he had kept from a distance, with occasional phone calls and Christmas cards, never wanting to intrude. He was scrolling past photos of barbecues and fishing trips, when a post from Eleanor's niece, a young woman he barely knew, snagged his attention. It was a short, frantic plea, posted on a community watch page. "Is anyone in the old neighborhood? My aunt, Eleanor Vance, is being harassed by a gang called the Vipers. They're trying to take her house. The police won't help her. She's a disabled widow and she's all alone. Please, can anyone help?" Dutch read the post once, then a second time. The words disabled widow, gang, police won't help, and Eleanor Vance slammed into him like a physical blow. A cold, familiar rage, an emotion he had long since buried under layers of suburban tranquility, began to smolder in his chest. He looked at the profile picture accompanying the post. Eleanor, smiling, sitting in her wheelchair next to one of her famous rose bushes. Beside her, his arm protectively around her shoulder, was Michael. The sight of his friend's face, smiling and full of life, juxtaposed with the desperate plea from his niece, was a lit fuse. The promise he had made at the funeral was no longer a passive sentiment. It was an active command. Dutch didn't call the police in Eleanor's town. He knew, with the cynical certainty of a man who had seen the failures of bureaucracy up close, that it would be useless. The system had failed. It was time for a different system to be activated. He stood up, walked into his garage, and opened a large military-grade footlocker that sat in the corner, covered by a dusty tarp. Inside there was no memorabilia. There was only gear. He pulled out a small encrypted satellite phone. He scrolled through the contacts list. The names were not names. They were call signs. Reaper, Doc, Ghost, Atlas, Breaker. His team, Michael's team. He dialed the first number. The phone rang twice before a quiet, steady voice answered. "Reaper. It's Dutch," he said, his voice flat, devoid of pleasantries. "We have a situation." There was no hesitation on the other end. "Give me the coordinates." Dutch gave him the address of Eleanor Vance's home. "It's for Michael," Dutch added, the only explanation needed. A beat of silence. Then, "Understood. I'm 2 hours out from the nearest airfield." The call ended. He dialed the second number. "Doc, talk to me, Dutch. It's for Michael. Say no more. Send me the address. I'll have my bag packed in 20. One by one he made the calls. To Ghost, a quiet surveillance expert now working as a high school science teacher in Oregon. To Atlas, a mountain of a man who ran a security firm in Chicago. To Breaker, a demolitions expert turned civil engineer in Florida. The conversations were all the same. Brief, coded, efficient. The trigger phrase was always, "It's for Mike." It was a key that unlocked a door to a room they had all left behind, but had never fully sealed. It was a call to arms that no one on that list would ever ignore. Within 30 minutes, 6 men, scattered across the United States, were in motion. They were leaving their jobs, their families, their ordinary lives, with simple, vague explanations. A work emergency. A friend needs help. They were converging on a single point on the map, a small, forgotten town, where a promise was about to be kept. The calm, suburban contractor named Marcus Thorne was gone. In his place was Dutch, the strategist, the leader, his mind already working, calculating, planning. The Vipers had made a catastrophic miscalculation. They thought they were targeting a helpless old woman. They had no idea they had just kicked a hornet's nest. And the hornets were rangers. The gathering of the storm was silent and unseen. While the Vipers continued their lazy, arrogant campaign of terror in one small town, a network of formidable men was closing in from all directions, a ghost squadron mobilizing with practiced, lethal efficiency. From Chicago, Liam Atlas O'Connell excused himself from a high-stakes corporate security meeting. He was a giant of a man, dressed in a tailored $3,000 suit, commanding a room of executives with an aura of unshakable confidence. When his phone vibrated with the call from Dutch, his expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted, a professional polish giving way to a primal focus. He ended the meeting abruptly, citing a critical asset integrity issue. Within the hour, his suit was replaced by worn jeans and a black hoodie. The only asset whose integrity he cared about was the honor of a fallen brother. He was on a red-eye flight, a duffel bag, containing nothing but changes of clothes and a formidable set of skills, stowed above him. In a quiet high school in Portland, Oregon, Mr. Elias Vance, no relation to Eleanor, a coincidence the team always found amusing, known as Ghost, was in the middle of a chemistry lecture about covalent bonds. He was thin, bespectacled, and had a gentle academic air that made him a favorite among his students. When his phone buzzed, he glanced at the caller ID and a stillness came over him. He finished his sentence on the whiteboard, then calmly told his class to read the next chapter quietly. He walked into the prep room, took the call, and simply said, "On my way." He called in a substitute for a family emergency, his mind already shifting from chemical formulas to surveillance patterns, escape routes, and fields of fire. His emergency was family, just not the kind his principal would understand. From a trauma bay in a busy Miami hospital, Dr. Ben Carter, or Doc, stripped off his bloody gloves. He had just spent 6 hours fighting to save the victim of a multi-car pileup. He was bone-tired, running on caffeine and adrenaline. The call from Dutch was a different kind of adrenaline. It was a call to a different kind of duty. He found his supervising physician, told him he was taking an immediate leave of absence due to a personal crisis, and ignored the question. His medical bag, always ready, was in his car, but he packed a second, smaller kit, one filled with supplies for battlefield trauma, not civilian accidents. The skills were the same, but the context was about to become radically different. In rural Pennsylvania, Logan Reaper Jones was underneath a vintage Ford Mustang, covered in grease, meticulously restoring its engine. His garage was his sanctuary, a place of quiet focus. The ringing of the satellite phone was a sound he hadn't heard in years, but his reaction was instantaneous. He slid out from under the car, wiped his hands on a rag, and answered. After Dutch's brief message, he simply closed the garage door, leaving the half-finished engine without a second thought. Some things were more important than restoration. He was the team's point man, the first one through the door, and his movements were already economical and purposeful as he packed a bag and started the long drive. Finally, in Florida, Kyle Breaker Tanaka was reviewing blueprints for a new municipal bridge. His life was about order, precision, and building things meant to last. The call from Dutch was a signal to engage in a different kind of engineering, the systematic dismantling of a threat. He informed his firm he was taking a mandatory vacation, effective immediately. His colleagues were surprised by his abruptness, but no one argued. There was a dormant authority in Breaker that rarely surfaced, but when it did, it commanded respect. They all converged on a predetermined rendezvous point, a cheap, anonymous motel 20 miles outside of Eleanor's town. They arrived within hours of each other, trickling in one by one, under the cover of darkness. The reunion was not one of boisterous greetings or backslapping. It was a quiet, somber affair, a gathering of professionals with a job to do. They met in Dutch's room, the air thick with unspoken understanding. Atlas stood by the door, a silent, immovable guard. Ghost was already on his laptop, cross-referencing public records and social media to build a detailed dossier on the Viper. Doc laid out a small medical kit on the cheap motel bed, just in case. Reaper and Breaker stood over a satellite map of the town that Ghost had pulled up, their eyes tracing routes, identifying choke points, and marking the Viper's known hangout. Dutch stood in the center of it all, the quiet hub of the wheel. "Ghost, what do we have?" he asked, his voice low. "Vipers," Ghost reported, never looking up from his screen. "Approximately 20 to 25 members, mostly low-level thugs, drug dealers and enforcers. Leader is Rico Razor Delgado, multiple priors for assault, intimidation, extortion. He's arrogant, likes to make a public show of force. Their base of operations is a derelict warehouse on the east side of town, but their preferred haunt is a dive bar called the Serpent's Coil downtown. They feel safe there." "Patrols?" Dutch asked. "Police are either scared or paid off," Ghost replied. "Response times are slow. They avoid the Viper's territory. Eleanor Street is a gray zone. They'll respond, but they won't engage." Dutch nodded slowly, absorbing the information. He looked around the room at the faces of his men. They were older now, their faces etched with the lines of their new lives, but their eyes were the same, sharp, focused, and utterly committed. They were no longer contractors, teachers, or doctors. They were rangers again. "All right," Dutch said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Phase 1 is intel, Ghost, Reaper. You're on recon. I want eyes on Eleanor's house, 24/7, starting now. I want to know every move the Vipers make. I want to know their routines, their numbers, their weaknesses. No contact, pure observation. The rest of us will analyze the intel and formulate a plan of action. They've given Eleanor a deadline. We'll use it against them. They think they're hunting a sheep. They're about to find out they've been stalking tigers." The plan was set. The pieces were in motion. The storm had gathered, and it was about to break.
The next 48 hours were a masterclass in psychological torture for Eleanor, and a clinic in silent, patient observation for the Rangers. Friday night arrived, marking the beginning of the final weekend before Razor's deadline expired. The Vipers, growing impatient and more brazen, decided to escalate their campaign. At around midnight, when the street was shrouded in an inky, moonless black, two of them crept onto Eleanor's property. From a darkened van parked a block away, Reaper watched them through a pair of military-grade night vision binoculars. His breath steady, his hands perfectly still. He noted their movements, their lack of discipline, their clumsy attempts at stealth. Two tangos, south side of the property, moving toward the house, he murmured into his throat mic, his voice a barely audible whisper. They're carrying spray cans. Ghost, positioned on the flat roof of a commercial building 2 blocks over, had a wider thermal view. "Confirmed," he whispered back. "I have them. No weapons visible, just paint. This is harassment, not assault. Stand by." In the motel room, Dutch, Atlas, and the others listened to the comms traffic, their faces grim. The urge to intervene, to descend on those two thugs and break them, was a powerful, visceral thing. But Dutch's orders were absolute. No contact. Not yet. The operation had to be clean, decisive, and final. A street brawl would solve nothing. Dismantling their entire power structure would. Eleanor was jolted awake by the sharp, hissing sound of the spray cans. It was a sound like snakes whispering threats, just outside her window. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of sleep. She wheeled herself to the living room window and peered through the blinds. In the dim glow of the distant streetlights, she saw them. 2 shadowy figures, defacing her home. They were laughing as they worked, their crude, ugly laughter carrying on the night air. They sprayed their coiled snake symbol over her front door, a grotesque mockery of a welcome wreath. They scrawled obscenities across the siding, the words like acid on the skin of her memories. Each hiss of the can, each burst of paint, felt like a physical blow. She felt utterly, profoundly violated. The home that had been her shield now felt like it was being desecrated, its sanctity stripped away layer by layer. She didn't call the police. What was the point? They would just file another report. Instead, she sat in the dark, a silent prisoner, in her own home, and cried. She cried for her husband, for her lost peace, for her own powerlessness. By Saturday morning, the full extent of the damage was visible in the harsh light of day. Her beautiful little bungalow looked like it had been savage. The bright, cheerful yellow siding was now a canvas of hate. Neighbors walked by, their gazes averted, their pace quickening. They saw the vandalism, and their fear only intensified. They saw it, not as an attack on one of their own, but as a warning to them all. Stay away. Don't get involved. The Rangers saw it too. When the sun came up, Reaper did a slow, careful walk past the house, disguised as a morning jogger, his eyes taking in every detail. He relayed the information back to Dutch. The anger in the motel room was palpable, a low-frequency hum of controlled fury. Atlas clenched and unclenched his fists, the size of small hams. Doc cleaned his glasses with a slow, deliberate motion, his jaw tight, They're escalating, Dutch stated, the obvious hanging heavy in the air. They're trying to break her spirit before they take the house. They want her to run. She's not running. Reaper's voice came over the comms, a note of respect in his tone. Lights are on. I can see her through the window. She's cleaning. And she was, with a bucket of soapy water and a long-handled brush. Eleanor was outside, scrubbing at the paint. It was a futile, heartbreaking effort. The paint was oil-based, and it smeared, staining the siding in ugly permanent blotches. Her arms ached, her heart ached, but she refused to let them see her broken. This small act of defiance, this refusal to surrender her home to their filth, was all she had left. Ghost, from his perch, zoomed in with his high-powered camera, documenting everything, the graffiti, the fear on the neighbor's face, and Eleanor, small and determined in her wheelchair, fighting a losing battle against the tide of hate. He sent the images to Dutch's laptop. Seeing her there, so vulnerable yet so unyielding, solidified their resolve into something as hard and sharp as diamond. The Vipers weren't just threatening a widow, they were dishonoring the memory of a sergeant major of the 75th Ranger Regiment. They were desecrating a monument. And for that, there could be no forgiveness. The time for observation was nearly over. The time for action was approaching. That night, the Vipers escalated again, throwing a rock through her living room window. The sound of shattering glass was the sound of her last nerve snapping. But unseen by her, this was the final piece of intel the Rangers needed. Ghost had captured the act on video. They now had a clear pattern of escalating criminality. They had the identities of the key players. They had their routines. They had everything. In the motel room, Dutch closed his laptop. That's it, he said, his voice cold and final. They've crossed the line. Tomorrow night, we end this. Breaker, you and Atlas, you're with me. We're going to their favorite place. Reaper, Ghost, you're on Overwatch and support. Doc, you're our mobile reserve. He looked at the faces of his men. The time for patience was over. The hunter was about to become the hunt. Tomorrow, Dutch said, we remind them what happens when you bully the wrong person. Sunday evening descended upon the town with a humid, oppressive stillness. The air was thick, promising a storm that hadn't yet broken. For the Vipers, it was a night like any other. They were gathered at their preferred sanctuary, the dive bar known as the Serpent's Coil. It was a place that reeked of stale beer, cheap whiskey, and unearned confidence. The lighting was dim, the music was loud, and the patrons were either members of the gang or locals too intimidated to go anywhere else. Razor sat at his usual table in the back, holding court like a low-rent king. He was laughing, bragging about the old woman in the wheelchair, about how she was scrubbing the paint off her house, like a frantic little mouse. His cronies laughed with him, their sycophantic chuckles feeding his already bloated ego. They felt untouchable in this place. It was their fortress, their den. They were predators at rest, secure in their position, at the top of the local food chain. They had no idea that a higher order of predator was about to walk through the door. At precisely 9 p.m., the front door of the Serpent's Coil swung open. The noisy, chaotic energy of the bar did not change at first. No one paid any attention. But then the first man stepped inside, and a subtle shift began. It was Dutch. He was not large or overtly muscular like Atlas, but he moved with an economy of motion and a quiet authority that was more intimidating than any amount of bulk. He was wearing simple, dark clothing, jeans, a plain t-shirt, a light jacket. He scanned the room once, his eyes calm and assessing, instantly cataloging every occupant, every exit, every potential threat. Following him was Atlas. If Dutch was the quiet threat, Atlas was the physical statement. He had to duck his head to get through the doorway. His shoulders seemed to span the entire frame. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace that belied his immense size, like a grizzly bear that knew it had no natural enemies. He positioned himself just inside the door, his arms crossed over his massive chest, becoming a human wall. His presence alone seemed to suck the oxygen out of the entrance. The third man was Breaker. He was leaner than the others, with a sharp, intelligent face, and eyes that missed nothing. He moved to the side, his back to the wall, his gaze sweeping the room with a practiced, analytical coolness. He wasn't just looking at the people, he was looking at the structure of the room itself. 3 more men entered in quick succession, fanning out with the same unspoken, coordinated purpose. Reaper, his face a mask of cold neutrality, took a position near the bar, his body relaxed but poised. Ghost, seeming to melt into the shadows near the jukebox, was a phantom presence. And Doc, carrying a small, innocuous-looking satchel, stood near the center of the room, looking for all the world like a man just waiting for a friend. The entire entry had taken less than 10 seconds. 6 men, all dressed in unremarkable civilian clothes, had taken up strategic positions throughout the bar, without saying a single word, but their collective presence was a deafening shout in the confined space. The loud music, which had masked their entrance, suddenly seemed to falter. The boisterous conversations began to die down, one by one, like lights being switched off. The clinking of glasses and the slap of pool cues ceased. A thick, heavy silence descended upon the room, broken only by the buzzing of a neon beer sign. Every eye in the place, from the Vipers to the terrified bartender, to the few civilian patrons, was now locked on the 6 silent strangers. They didn't look like cops. They didn't look like a rival gang. They looked like something else entirely. Something harder, more disciplined, more dangerous. Razor, annoyed at the interruption to his revelry, finally turned his head. He saw Dutch, standing in the middle of the room, looking directly at him, his scarred face twisted into a sneer of contempt. "Well, look what we have here," he said, his voice loud in the unnatural quiet. "You boys lost? The retirement home is 2 blocks down." A few of his men snickered nervously, but their laughter was thin and lacked conviction. They could feel it too. The air in the room had changed. The temperature had dropped. The casual, arrogant confidence that had filled the space moments before had evaporated, replaced by a tense, crackling uncertainty. Dutch didn't respond to the taunt. He simply held Razor's gaze, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched, becoming a weapon in itself. It was a silence that stripped away the Viper's bluster, leaving them exposed. In that quiet, every Viper in the room was suddenly, acutely aware of his own position, relative to the strangers. The one at the pool table noticed Breaker was between him and the door. The 2 at the bar realized Reaper was standing right behind them. Razor felt the weight of Dutch's stare like a physical pressure. This wasn't a random encounter. This was a calculated, tactical insertion. They had walked into the Viper's den not as prey, but as exterminator. The jukebox, which had been playing a thumping rock anthem, came to the end of the song, and the sudden, absolute silence was shocking. In that moment, Razor understood. These men were here for him. His sneer tightened, but a flicker of something else, unease, perhaps even a sliver of fear danced in his dark eyes. The battle had not yet begun, but the war was already lost. The heavy silence in the serpent's coil was a coiled spring, and Dutch was the one with his finger on the release. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, then another, his boots making no sound on the grimy linoleum floor. He stopped 10 feet from Razor's table, close enough for conversation, far enough to maintain a tactical advantage. Every Viper tensed, hands moving instinctively toward pockets or under jackets, but they all froze when they saw the look on Dutch's face. It was a look of utter disinterest in their posturing, the look a man gives an insect before he crushes it. "Rico Delgado," Dutch said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence with the clarity of a surgeon's scalpel. It was the first time anyone had used Razor's real name in this bar in years. The use of it was a statement in itself. "We know who you are, all of you." Razor's bravado, fueled by a mixture of whiskey and arrogance, surged back. "You know my name." "I'm flattered," he sneered, leaning back in his chair, trying to project an aura of casual dominance. "You and your geriatric crew here to get autographs." He gestured with his beer bottle at the other Rangers. "Or did you come to buy us around for cleaning up the neighborhood?" "We're here to deliver a message," Dutch said, his voice remaining flat and devoid of emotion. "You're done in this town. Your operations, your extortion, your intimidation. It all ends tonight." A wave of disbelief, followed by derisive laughter,
rippled through the Vipers. The sheer audacity of the statement was almost comical to them. 6 men telling a gang of 25 that they were finished. Razor slammed his bottle down on the table. "You hear that, boy? They're shutting us down," he roared, his face turning a blotchy red. "You walk into my place, into my town, and you give me orders." He stood up, knocking his chair over. He was a few inches shorter than Dutch, but wiry and coiled with a street fighter's nervous energy. "You've got a death wish, old man." Razor's biggest lieutenant, the hulking brute with the spiderweb tattoo, decided this was his cue to act. He took a step toward Dutch from the side, intending to grab him. "You're gonna," he started to say. He never finished the sentence. From his position by the door, Atlas moved. It was a blur of motion, shockingly fast for a man his size. He covered the 15 feet in what seemed like a single stride. Before the lieutenant could even register the threat, Atlas's hand, a massive slab of meat and bone, clamped down on the man's shoulder. There was a sickening crunch of bone and cartilage. The lieutenant's eyes went wide with shock and excruciating pain, a strangled gasp escaping his lips as his arm went completely numb. Atlas didn't hit him. He simply held him there for a second, a look of profound disappointment on his face, before casually shoving him into a table, which splintered under the man's weight. The sound of the cracking wood echoed like a gunshot in the stunned silence. That was the signal, the coiled spring unsprang. Razor, seeing his top man go down so easily, let out a yell of rage and lunged at Dutch, a switchblade appearing in his hand as if by magic. He was fast, but Reaper was faster. Moving from his position at the bar, Reaper intercepted Razor's lunge. He didn't block the knife, he moved inside its arc, his left hand deflecting Razor's wrist, while his right hand delivered a single precise, non-lethal strike to the side of Razor's neck. It was a nerve strike, delivered with pinpoint accuracy. Razor's entire body went rigid, the switchblade clattering to the floor, his eyes rolling back in his head as he crumpled into an unconscious heap. It was over in less than a second. The other Vipers, momentarily paralyzed by the shocking efficiency of the takedowns, finally reacted, their shock turning to a chaotic mix of fear and fury. 2 of them near the pool table grabbed cues and charged at Breaker. Breaker didn't even seem to move his feet. He sidestepped the first wild swing, using the man's own momentum to send him crashing into the wall. He then took the pool cue from the second man, snapping it in 2 over his knee as if it were a twig, and used the jagged ends to pin the man's jacket to the wall in a move that was both immobilizing and deeply humiliating. Ghost, melting out of the shadows, dealt with 2 more who were trying to flank Dutch. He moved like his call sign, a whisper of motion, a quick jab here, a joint lock there. They went down in a tangled heap, groaning in pain, not even sure what had hit them. The entire fight was over in less than 30 seconds. It wasn't a brawl. It was a clinical, systematic dismantling. 6 Vipers, the leader and his 5 most aggressive lieutenants, were incapacitated on the floor. The remaining 15 or so were frozen in place, their faces a mixture of terror and utter disbelief. They had just witnessed their entire leadership structure get taken apart with the emotionless precision of a bomb disposal squad. Doc hadn't moved from his spot, his satchel still unopened. He was, as always, the contingency plan that wasn't needed. Dutch looked down at the unconscious form of Razor, then let his cold gaze sweep over the remaining, terrified gang members. "This is your one and only warning," he said, his voice now carrying the weight of absolute authority. "We are leaving now. When he wakes up, you tell him the deal is done. You will pack your bags, you will leave this town, and you will never ever come back. You will not go near Eleanor Vance's house again. You will not so much as breathe her name. Is that understood?" A few of them nodded numbly, their eyes wide with fear. "I said," Dutch repeated, his voice dropping a full octave. "Is that understood?" A chorus of panicked yes, and yes sir filled the room. The bartender was hiding behind the bar, his head barely visible. The civilian patrons were pressed against the far wall, their faces pale. Atlas released the lieutenant's shoulder, and the man slumped to the floor, whimpering. "Let's go," Dutch said, and just as they had entered, the 6 men turned and walked out of the bar. They didn't run, they didn't look back, they simply left, melting back into the night, leaving behind a scene of shattered dominance and palpable fear. The reign of the Vipers was over. It had ended not with a bang, but with the cold, quiet, and terrifyingly efficient arrival of 6 old soldiers who had come to collect on a debt of honor. The aftermath, in the Serpent's Coil, was a study in disintegration. For a full minute after the Rangers left, no one moved. The only sounds were the low hum of the beer cooler and the pained groans of the incapacitated Vipers. The myth of their invincibility, the foundation of their power, had been shattered in 30 seconds of brutal balletic violence. The fear they had so carefully cultivated in the town had now been turned back on them, magnified 100-fold. When Razor finally stirred, groaning as consciousness returned, he found himself not surrounded by his loyal soldiers, but by the terrified, uncertain faces of a broken gang. The Alpha had been publicly neutered, and the pack was in disarray. Word of what happened spread through the town's underworld with the speed of a lit fuse. It wasn't a police raid. It wasn't a rival gang war. It was something else, something almost supernatural. 6 ghosts had walked into their fortress, dismantled their leadership without breaking a sweat, and vanished. By morning, the exodus had begun. The Vipers, stripped of their leader's authority, and terrified of the silent, nameless force that had targeted them, started to scatter. They packed their bags, sold off their stolen goods for pennies on the dollar, and fled. Their intimidating presence on the streets evaporated overnight. The growl of their motorcycles was replaced by an unfamiliar peaceful silence. Meanwhile, the Rangers' mission was not yet complete. At dawn, a simple, unadorned work van pulled up in front of Eleanor Vance's house. Out of it stepped Dutch, Atlas, and Breaker. They weren't wearing tactical gear. They were dressed as what they were in their other lives: contractors. They carried toolboxes, paint cans, and a pane of glass. Eleanor, who had spent another sleepless night, listening to every creak of the house, watched them from her window, with a mixture of fear and confusion. Who were these men? Were they more of Razor's thugs, come to finish the job? Then Dutch turned and looked toward her window, and their eyes met. There was no menace in his gaze, only a calm, reassuring gentleness. He gave her a small, respectful nod. Hesitantly, Eleanor wheeled herself to the front door and opened it a crack. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Ma'am," Dutch said, his voice warm and respectful. "My name is Marcus Thorne. We're here about the vandalism. We'd like to fix it for you. No charge." Eleanor was stunned into silence. She didn't know what to say. These men, these complete strangers, were offering to repair the damage that had been a constant source of her terror. Breaker and Atlas didn't wait for an answer. They immediately set to work with quiet, professional efficiency. Atlas, with surprising gentleness, carefully removed the shattered remnants of the living room window and began prepping the frame for the new paint. Breaker started on the graffiti, using a special chemical solvent that stripped the Viper's ugly paint from the siding without damaging the wood beneath. Dutch approached the porch. "Mrs. Vance," he said softly, "my friends and we served with your husband, with Michael." Eleanor's eyes widened. She looked at him, truly looked at him. For the first time, she saw the quiet confidence, the steady gaze, and suddenly she saw a flicker of the same strength she had known in her husband. "You knew Michael?" she whispered. Dutch reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn, faded photograph. He handed it to her. It was a picture of a group of 7 young soldiers in the desert, grinning at the camera, their arms slung around each other's shoulders. In the center, taller than the rest, was a young Michael Van, and surrounding him were the younger faces of Dutch, Reaper, Ghost, Atlas, Breaker, and Doc. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes as she traced the image of her husband's face with her finger. "You're his boys," she said, a wave of understanding and overwhelming relief washing over her. "He talked about you all the time. He called you his brothers." "He was our brother too," Dutch said simply, "and we made him a promise that we'd always look out for you." For the first time in weeks, Eleanor's tears were not of fear or despair, but of profound, bone-deep gratitude. She let them come, a cleansing rain that washed away the last vestiges of her terror. The Rangers worked for the rest of the day. Ghost and Reaper, their surveillance mission complete, joined them. Doc showed up with coffee and sandwiches. They didn't just fix the damage. They restored the house. They repainted the siding where the graffiti had been, making it look new again. They replaced the window. Atlas, with a surprising eye for gardening, carefully pruned the damaged rose bush and restaked it. Breaker reinforced her front door lock. They moved with a shared, unspoken purpose, their actions a testament to their bond and their respect for the man whose memory inhabited this home. As the sun began to set, they finished. The house was no longer a target. It was a sanctuary once more. The scars were gone. The vipers were gone. The fear was gone. Before they left, they all gathered on the porch with Eleanor. There were no grand speeches. There was just a quiet moment of shared respect. "Thank you," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've given me back my home. You've given me back my peace." Atlas, the stoic giant, just nodded and said, "It was our honor, ma'am." Dutch knelt down so he was at eye level with her. "You won't be bothered again," he said. It wasn't a promise, it was a statement of, and with that, they left as quietly as they had arrived, their van disappearing down the street, leaving behind a restored home and a protected peace. The departure of the Rangers left a vacuum in the town, but it was a clean, healthy one, like the sterile environment after a fever breaks. The fear that had been a constant, oppressive weight on the neighborhood lifted. The vipers were not just gone. Their entire legend had been erased, replaced by a new, more terrifying one about 6 silent men who had come in the night and surgically removed them from existence. The change was almost immediate. The very next morning, Eleanor wheeled herself out to her garden, and for the first time in weeks, she didn't feel the prickle of being watched. The air itself felt lighter. Miss Gable from next door saw her, and after a moment's hesitation, walked over to her fence. "Eleanor," she said, her face a mixture of shame and relief. "I'm so sorry. We were all so scared." "I know," Eleanor said, offering a small forgiving smile. That simple exchange was like a dam breaking. Soon other neighbors emerged from their homes, drawn by the sight of Eleanor's restored house and the absence of the menacing motorcycles. They brought her flowers, baked goods, and apologies. The community, fractured by fear, began to knit itself back together. The fear that had isolated them was replaced by a collective sense of shame for their inaction, and a renewed determination to look out for one another. The local police, noticing the sudden and complete disappearance of the town's most notorious gang, were emboldened. They began to crack down on the petty crime that the vipers had allowed to fester. The town, which had been on a slow slide into decay, began to pull itself back up. It was as if the Rangers' decisive action had reset the moral compass of the entire community. The 6 men, meanwhile, had already dispersed, melting back into their civilian lives as seamlessly as they had emerged from them. Atlas was back in Chicago, commanding boardrooms in his expensive suit. Ghost was back in his classroom, explaining the laws of thermodynamics to teenagers. Doc was saving lives in the ER. Reaper was back under his Mustang. Breaker was building bridges. And Dutch was coaching Little League. They were ordinary men once more, carrying the secret of their weekend's work in the quiet chambers of their heart. They sought no credit, no thanks beyond the knowledge that their promise had been kept. Their only communication was a single, encrypted group text sent by Dutch. "Mission complete. Job well done. See you at the next reunion." For Eleanor, life returned to a new kind of normal. It was the peaceful rhythm of her old life, but underlaid with a new, profound sense of security. She was not alone. She had a team of unseen, guardian angels, bound to her by the love and loyalty they held for her husband. She tended to her rose garden, and under her care, the bush that Razor had brutalized began to show new signs of life. A small, green shoot emerging from the damaged stem. It was a symbol of her own resilience. One sunny afternoon, she took one of Michael's medals from its case, the Distinguished Service Cross, and polished it until it gleamed. She placed it on the mantelpiece, right next to a small vase holding a single, perfect, newly bloomed rose from her garden. The polished silver of the metal and the soft crimson of the flower stood side by side, symbols of two different kinds of strength, two different kinds of courage. They represented the love that builds a life and the fierce loyalty that will cross a country to defend it. The story of what happened on that quiet street serves as a powerful reminder. It's a reminder that evil thrives in the silence of good people, but it is also a testament to the fact that there are still those in the world who live by a code, who understand that some promises are sacred, and that the true measure of a person is not the power they wield, but how they use it to protect the vulnerable. The legacy of Sergeant Major Michael Vance wasn't just in the medals under glass or the photographs on the wall. It was in the unbreakable bond of the men he called brothers, and in the quiet peace of his wife, safe in the home they had built together, a fortress protected, not by locks and alarms, but by the enduring spirit of the American Ranger. And if this story of justice and brotherhood resonated with you, share it with a friend, because the world needs more reminders that even in the darkest of times, heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes, they're just a handful of old soldiers who refuse to let a promise die.